Rant Reading, a serial killer. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, May 21st, 1960 to November 28th, 1994, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial killer and sex offender who committed the murder and dismemberment of 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Many of his later murders involved necrophilia, cannibalism, and the permanent preservation of body parts, typically all or part of the skeleton. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder, Dahmer was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 15 of the 16 murders he had committed in Wisconsin and was sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Dahmer was later sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment for an additional homicide committed in Ohio in 1978. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Early life. Childhood. Dahmer was born May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the first of two sons of Joyce Annette, a teletype machine instructor, and Lionel Herbert Dahmer, a Marquette University chemistry student and later research chemist. Lionel Dahmer was of German and Welsh ancestry, and Joyce Dahmer was of Norwegian and Irish ancestry. Some sources report Dahmer was deprived of attention as an infant. Other sources, however, suggest that Dahmer was generally doted upon as an infant and toddler by both parents, although his mother was known to be tense, greedy for both attention and pity, and argumentative with her husband and their neighbors. As Dahmer entered his first grade, Lionel's university studies kept him away from home much of the time. When he was home, his wife, a hypochondriac who had depression, demanded constant attention and spent an increasing amount of time in bed. On one occasion, she is known to have attempted suicide with NQUIL. Consequently, neither parent devoted much time to their son, who later recollected that from an early age he felt unsure of the solidity of the family, recalling extreme tension and numerous arguments between his parents during his early years. Dahmer had been an energetic and happy child, but became notably subdued after a double hernia surgery shortly before his 4th birthday. At elementary school, Dahmer was regarded as quiet and timid. One teacher later recollected she detected early signs of abandonment in Dahmer due to his mother's illnesses, the symptoms of which increased when she became pregnant with her second child. Nonetheless, in grade school, Dahmer did have a small number of friends. In October 1966, the family moved to Doylestown, Ohio. When Joyce gave birth in December, Jeffrey was allowed to choose the name of his new baby brother. He chose the name David. The same year, Lionel earned his degree and started work as an analytical chemist in nearby Akron, Ohio. From an early age, Dahmer manifested an interest in dead animals. His fascination with dead animals may have begun when, at the age of 4, he saw his father removing animal bones from beneath the family home. According to Lionel, Dahmer was oddly thrilled by the sound of the bones made and became preoccupied with animal bones, which he initially called his fiddlesticks. He occasionally searched beneath and around the family home for additional bones and explored the bodies of live animals to discover where their bones were located. In 1968, the family moved to Bath Township, Summit County, Ohio. This address was their 3rd in 2 years, and the Dahmer's 6th address since marriage. The home stood in 1.5 acres of woodland, with a small hut being only a short walk from the house, where Dahmer began collecting large insects such as dragonflies and moths and the skeletons of small animals, such as chipmunks and squirrels. Some of these remains were preserved in jars of formaldehyde and stored within the hut. 2 years later, during a chicken dinner, Dahmer asked Lionel what would happen if the chicken's bones were placed in bleach. Lionel, pleased by what he believed to be his son's scientific curiosity, demonstrated how to safely bleach and preserve animal bones. Dahmer incorporated these preserving techniques into his bone collecting and also began collecting dead animals, including roadkill, which he would dissect and bury beside the hut, with the skulls occasionally placed atop makeshift crosses. According to one friend, Dahmer explained to him that he was curious as to how animals fitted together. In one instance, in 1975, Dahmer decapitated the carcass of a dog before nailing the body to a tree and impaling the skull upon a stake in the woodland behind his house as a prank. He later invited a friend to view the display, claiming he had discovered the remains by chance. The same year, Lionel taught his son how to preserve animal bones. Joyce began increasing her daily consumption of Equinol, laxatives, and sleeping pills, further minimizing her tangible contact with her husband and children. Adolescence in high school. From his freshman year at Revere High School, Dahmer was seen as an outcast. By the age of 14, he had begun drinking beer and hard alcohol in daylight hours, frequently concealing his liquor inside the jacket he wore to school. He is known to have mentioned to one classmate who inquired why he was drinking scotch in a morning history class that alcohol he consumed was my medicine. Although largely uncommunicative in his freshman year, Dahmer was seen by staff as polite and highly intelligent but with average grades. He was a keen tennis player and played briefly in the high school band. When he reached puberty, Dahmer discovered he was gay. He did not tell his parents in his early teens. He had a brief relationship with another teenage boy, although they never had intercourse. By Dahmer's later admission, he began fantasizing about dominating and controlling a completely submissive male partner in his early to mid-teens, and his masturbatory fantasies gradually evolved to his focus upon the chest and torsos of the focus of his fantasies. These fantasies gradually became intertwined with dissection. When he was about 16, Dahmer conceived the fantasy of rendering unconscious a particular male jogger he found attractive and then making sexual use of the body. On one occasion, Dahmer concealed himself in bushes with a baseball bat to lie in wait for this man. However, he did not pass by on that particular day. Dahmer later said that this was the first time he attempted to attack someone. Despite being regarded as a loner and an oddball among his peers at RHS, Dahmer became something of a class clown, who often staged pranks which became known as doing a Dahmer. These included bleeding and stimulating epileptic seizures or cerebral palsy at school and local stores. By 1977, Dahmer's grades had declined. His parents hired a private tutor with limited success. The same year, in an attempt to save their marriage, his parents attended counseling sessions. They continued to quarrel frequently when Lionel discovered Joyce had engaged in a brief affair in September 1977. They both decided to divorce, telling their sons they wished to do so amicably. Lionel moved out of the house in early 1978, temporarily residing in a motel on North Cleveland Mason Road. In May 1978, Dahmer graduated from high school. A few weeks before his graduation, one of his teachers observed Dahmer sitting close to the school parking lot drinking several cans of beer. When the teacher threatened to report the matter, Dahmer informed him he was experiencing a lot of problems at home and that the school's guidance counselor was aware of them. That spring, Joyce and David moved out of the family home to live with their relatives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Dahmer had just turned 18 and remained in the family home. Dahmer's parents' divorce was finalized on July 24, 1978. Joyce was awarded custody of her younger son and alimony payments. Late teens and early 20s. First murder. Murder of Stephen Hicks. Dahmer committed his first murder in 1978. 3 weeks after his graduation on June 18th, Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks, who was almost 19. Dahmer lured the youth to his house on the pretext of drinking. Hicks, who had been hitchhiking to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park, Ohio, agreed to accompany Dahmer to his house upon the promise of a few beers with Dahmer, as he had the house to himself. According to Dahmer, the sight of bare-chested Hicks standing at the roadside stirred his sexual feelings, although when Hicks began talking about girls, he knew any sexual passes he made would be rebuffed. After several hours of talking and drinking and listening to music, Hicks wanted to leave, and I didn't want him to. Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell. He later stated he struck Hicks twice from behind with the dumbbell as Hicks sat upon a chair. When Hicks fell unconscious, Dahmer strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell and stripped the clothes from Hicks's body before exploring his chest with his hands. Then masturbating as he stood above the corpse the following day, Dahmer dissected Hicks's body in his basement. He later buried the remains in a shallow grave in his backyard, before several weeks later unearthing the remains and paring the flesh from the bones. To dissolve flesh in acid before flushing the solution down the toilet, he crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woodland behind the family home. College and Army service. 6 weeks after the murder of Hicks, Dahmer's father and his fiancée returned to his home, where they discovered Jeffery living alone at the house. That August, Dahmer enrolled at The Ohio State University, hoping to major in business. Dahmer's sole term at OSU was completely unproductive, largely because of his persistent alcohol abuse throughout the majority of the term. He received failing grades, introduction to anthropology, classical civilizations, and administrative science. The only course Dahmer was successful at was riflery, having received a B- grade. His overall GPA was 0.45 out of a 4.0. On one occasion, Lionel paid a surprise visit to his son, only to find his room strewn with empty liquor bottles. Despite his father having paid in advance for the second term, Dahmer dropped out of OSU after just 3 months. In January 1979, on his father's urging, Dahmer enlisted the United States Army, where he trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. On July 13, 1979, he was deployed to Baumholder, West Germany, where he served as a combat medic at 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment, 8th Infantry Division. According to published reports, in Dahmer's first year of service, he was an average or slightly above average soldier. Owing to Dahmer's alcohol abuse, his performance deteriorated, and in March 1981, he was deemed unsuitable for military service and was later discharged from the Army. He received an honorable discharge as his superiors did not believe that the problems that Dahmer had in the Army would be applicable to civilian life. On March 24, 1981, Dahmer was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for debriefing. He provided with a plane ticket to travel anywhere in the country. Dahmer later told police he felt he could not return home to face his father, so he opted to travel to Miami Beach, Florida, both because he was tired of the cold and an attempt to live by his own means. In Florida, Dahmer found employment at a delicatessen and rented a room in a nearby motel. Dahmer spent most of his salary on alcohol and was soon convicted from the motel for non-payment. He initially spent his evenings on the beach as he continued to work at the sandwich shop, until phoning his father and asking to return to Ohio in September of the same year. Returned to Ohio and relocation to West Allis, Wisconsin. After his return to Ohio, Dahmer initially resided with his father and stepmother and insisted on being delegated numerous chores to occupy his time while he looked for work. He continued to drink heavily, and 2 weeks after his return, Dahmer was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, for which he was fined $60 and given a suspended 10-day jail sentence. Dahmer's father tried unsuccessfully to wean his son off alcohol. In December 1981, he and Dahmer's stepmother sent him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Dahmer's grandmother was the only family member to whom he displayed any affection. They hoped that her influence, plus the change of scenery, might persuade Dahmer to quit drinking, find a job, and live responsibly. Initially, Dahmer's living arrangements with his grandmother were harmonious. He accompanied her to church, willingly undertook chores, actively sought work, and abided by most of her house rules, although he continued to drink and smoke. This new influence in his life initially brought results, and in early 1982, Dahmer found employment as a optimist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. He had held this job for a total of 10 months before being laid off. Dahmer remained unemployed for over 2 years, during which he lived upon whatever money his grandmother gave him. Shortly before losing his job, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure. On August 7, 1982, at Wisconsin State Fair Park, he was observed to expose himself on the side of the Coliseum in which 25 people were present, including women and children. For this incident, he was convicted and fined $50 plus court costs. In January 1985, Dahmer was hired as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosio Chocolate Factory, where he worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 6 nights per week, with the Saturday evenings off. Shortly after Dahmer found this employment, an incident occurred in which he was propositioned by another man while sitting reading in the West Allis Public Library. The stranger threw Dahmer a note offering to perform fellatio upon him. Although Dahmer did not respond to this proposition, the incident stirred in his mind the fantasies of control and dominance he had developed as a teenager, and he began to familiarize himself with Milwaukee's gay bars, gay bathhouses, and bookstores. He is also known to have stolen a male mannequin from a store, which he briefly used for sexual stimulation until his grandmother discovered the item, stowed in a closet, and demanded that he discard it. By late 1985, Dahmer had begun to regularly frequent the bathhouses, which he later described as being relaxing places. But during his sexual encounters, he became frustrated at his partners moving during the act. Following his arrest, he stated, "I trained myself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of as people." For this reason, beginning in June 1986, he administered sleeping pills to his partners, giving them liquor laced with sedatives. He then waited for his partner to fall asleep before performing various sexual acts. To maintain an adequate supply of this medication, Dahmer informed doctors he worked nights and required the tablets to adjust his body to work unsociable hours. After approximately 12 such instances, the bathhouses administration revoked Dahmer's membership, and he began to use hotel rooms to continue this practice. Shortly after his membership of the bathhouses was revoked, Dahmer read a report in a newspaper regarding the upcoming funeral of an 18-year-old male. He conceived the idea of stealing the freshly interned corpse and taking it home. According to Dahmer, he attempted to dig up the coffin from the ground, but found the soil too hard and abandoned the plan. On September 8, 1986, Dahmer was arrested upon a charge of lewd and lascivious behavior for masturbating in the presence of two 12-year-old boys as he stood close to the Kinnickinnick River. He initially claimed he had merely been urinating, unaware that there were witnesses, but soon admitted the offense. The charge was changed to disorderly conduct, and on March 10, 1987, Dahmer was sentenced to 1 year probation with additional instructions stating he was to undergo counseling. Late 20s and early 30s, subsequent murders. Ambassador Hotel. On November 20th, 1987, Dahmer, at the time residing with his grandmother in West Allis, encountered a 25-year-old man from Onondaga, Michigan, Stephen Toomey, at a bar and persuaded him to return to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, where Dahmer had rented a room for the evening. According to Dahmer, he had no intention of murdering Toomey, but rather intended to simply drug him and lie beside him as he explored his body. The following morning, however, Dahmer awoke to find Toomey lying beneath him on the bed, his chest crushed in and black and blue with bruises. Blood was also seeping from the corner of his mouth, and Dahmer's fists and forearm were extensively bruised. Dahmer stated he had no memory of having killed Toomey, and later informed investigators that he could not believe that this had happened. To dispose of Toomey's body, Dahmer purchased a large suitcase in which he transported the body to his grandmother's residence. There, 1 week later, he severed the head, arms, legs from the torso and then filleted the bones from the body before cutting the flesh into pieces small enough to handle. Dahmer then placed the flesh inside plastic garbage bags. He wrapped the bones inside a sheet and pounded them into splinters with a sledgehammer. The entire dismemberment process took Dahmer approximately 2 hours to complete, and he disposed of all Toomey's remains, excluding the severed head, in the trash. For a total of 2 weeks following Toomey's murder, Dahmer retained the victim's head wrapped in a blanket. After 2 weeks, Dahmer boiled the head in a mixture of Soliax, an alkali-based industrial detergent, and bleach in an effort to retain the skull, which he then used as stimulus for masturbation. Eventually, the skull was rendered too brittle by this bleaching process, so Dahmer pulverized it and disposed of it. Intermediate incidences. Following the murder of Toomey, Dahmer began to actively seek victims, most of whom he encountered in or close to gay bars, and whom he typically lured to his grandmother's home. He would drug his victim with Tralzolol or diazepam before or shortly after engaging in sexual activity with them. Once he had rendered his victims unconscious with the sleeping pills, he killed them by strangulation. 2 months after the Toomey murder, Dahmer encountered a 14-year-old Native American male prostitute named James Dockstor. Dahmer lured the youth to his home with an offer of $50 to pose for nude pictures. At Dahmer's West Allis residence, the pair engaged in sexual activity before Dahmer drugged Dockstor and strangled him on the floor of the cellar. Dahmer left the body in the cellar for 1 week before dismembering it in much the same manner as he had with Toomey. He placed all of Dockstor's remains, excluding the skull, in the trash. The skull was boiled and cleansed in bleach. Before Dahmer noted it been rendered too brittle by this process, he pulverized the skull 2 weeks later. On March 24th, 1988, Dahmer met a 22-year-old bisexual man named Richard Guerrero outside a gay bar called The Phoenix. Dahmer lured Guerrero to his grandmother's residence, although the incentive on this occasion was $50 to simply spend the remainder of the night with him. He then drugged Guerrero with sleeping pills and strangled him with a leather strap, with Dahmer then performing oral sex upon the corpse. Dahmer dismembered Guerrero's body within 24 hours of murdering him, again disposing of the remains in the trash and retaining the skull before pulverizing it 2 months later. On April 23rd, Dahmer lured another young man to his house. However, after giving the victim a drugged coffee, both he and the intended victim heard Dahmer's grandmother call. "Is that you, Jeff?" Although Dahmer replied in a manner that led his grandmother to believe he was alone, she did observe that Dahmer was not alone. Because of this, Dahmer opted to not kill this particular victim, instead of waiting until he had become unconscious before taking him to the County General Hospital. In September 1988, Dahmer's grandmother asked him to move out, largely because of his drinking, his habit of bringing young men to her house late at night, and the foul smells occasionally emanating from both the basement and the garage. Dahmer found a one-bedroom apartment at 808 North 24th Street and moved into his new residence up to September 25th. 2 days later, he was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy whom he had lured to his home on the pretext of posing nude for photographs. Dahmer's father hired an attorney named Gerald Boyle to defend his son. At Boyle's request, Dahmer underwent a series of psychological evaluations prior to his upcoming court hearings. These evaluations revealed Dahmer harbored deep feelings of alienation. A second evaluation 2 months later revealed Dahmer to be an impulsive individual, suspicious of others and dismayed by his lack of accomplishments in life. His probation officer would also reference a 1987 diagnosis of Dahmer suffering from a schizoid personality disorder for the presentation to the court. On January 30th, 1989, Dahmer pleaded guilty to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and enticing of a child for immoral purposes. Sentencing for the assault was suspended until May. On March 20th, Dahmer commenced a 10-day Easter absence from work, during which he moved back to his grandmother's home. 2 months after his conviction and 2 months prior to his sentencing for the sexual assault, Dahmer murdered his fifth victim, a mixed-race 24-year-old aspiring model named Anthony Sears, whom Dahmer met at a gay bar on March 25th, 1989. According to Dahmer, on this particular occasion, he was not looking to commit a crime. However, shortly before closing time that evening, Sears just started talking to me. Dahmer lured Sears to his grandmother's home, where the pair engaged in oral sex before Dahmer drugged and strangled Sears. The following morning, Dahmer placed the corpse in his grandmother's bathtub, where he decapitated the body, before attempting to fillet the corpse. He then stripped the flesh from the body and pulverized the bones, which he again disposed of in the trash. According to Dahmer, he found Sears exceptionally attractive, and Sears was the first victim from whom he permanently retained any body parts. He preserved Sears' head and genitalia in acetone and stored them in a wooden box, which he later placed in his work locker. When he moved to a new address the following year, he took the remains there. On May 23, 1989, Dahmer was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction with work release permitted in order that he be able to keep his job. He also required to register as a sex offender. 2 months before his scheduled release from the work camp, Dahmer was paroled from his regime. His 5-year probation imposed in 1989 began at this point. On release, Dahmer temporarily moved back to his grandmother's home in West Dallas before, in May 1990, moving into the Oxford Apartments located on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. Although located in a high-crime area, the apartment was close to his workplace, was furnished, and at $300 per month, inclusive of all bills, excluding electricity, was economical. 1990 killings. On May 14, 1990, Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's house and into 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213, taking Sears' mummified head and genitalia with him. Within 1 week of this moving into his new apartment, Dahmer had killed his sixth victim, Raymond Smith. Raymond was a 32-year-old male prostitute whom Dahmer lured to apartment 213 with the promise of $50 for sex. Inside the apartment, he gave Smith a drink laced with 7 sleeping pills, then manually strangled him. The following day, Dahmer purchased a Polaroid camera. With it, he took several pictures of Smith's body in suggestive positions before dismembering him in the bathroom. He boiled the legs, arms, and pelvis in a steel kettle with Soilex, which allowed him to then rinse the bones in his sink. Dahmer dissolved the remainder of Smith's skeleton, excluding the skull, in a container filled with acid. He later spray-painted Smith's skull, which he placed alongside the skull of Sears, upon a black towel inside a metal filing cabinet. Approximately 1 week after the murder of Smith, on or about May 27th, Dahmer lured another young man to his apartment. On this occasion, however, Dahmer himself accidentally consumed the drink laden with sedatives intended for consumption by his guest. When awoke the following day, he discovered his intended victim had stolen several items of his clothing, $300 and a watch. Dahmer never reported this incident to the police, although on May 29th he divulged to his probation officer that he had been robbed. On June 1990, Dahmer lured a 27-year-old acquaintance named Edward Smith to his apartment. He drugged and strangled Smith. On this occasion, rather than immediately acidifying the skeleton, a repeating process of the bleaching, which had rendered previous victims' skulls brittle, Dahmer placed Smith's skeleton in his freezer for several months in the hope it would not retain moisture. Freezing the skeleton did not remove moisture, and the skeleton of his victim would be acidified several months later. Dahmer accidentally destroyed the skull when he placed it in the oven to try a process that caused the skull to explode. Dahmer himself was to later inform police he had felt rotten about Smith's murder, and he had been unable to retain any of his body. Less than 3 months after the murder of Smith, Dahmer encountered a 22-year-old Chicago native named Ernest Miller outside a bookstore on the corner of North 27th Street. Miller agreed to accompany Dahmer to his apartment for $50 and further agreed to allow him to listen to his heart and stomach. When Dahmer attempted to perform oral sex upon Miller, he was informed that that'll cost extra. Whereupon Dahmer gave his intended victim a drink laced with 2 sleeping pills. On this occasion, Dahmer had only 2 sleeping pills to give his victim, therefore he killed Miller by slashing his carotid artery with the same knife he used to dissect his victims' bodies. Miller bled to death within minutes. Dahmer then posed the nude body for various suggested Polaroid photographs before placing in the bathtub of dismemberment. Dahmer repeatedly kissed and talked to the severed head while he dismembered the remainder of the body. Dahmer wrapped Miller's heart, biceps, and portions of flesh from legs in plastic bags and placed them in the fridge for later consumption. He boiled the remaining flesh and organs into a jelly-like substance using Soilax, which again enabled him to rinse the flesh off the skeleton, which he intended to retain. To preserve the skeleton, Dahmer placed the bones in a light bleach solution for 24 hours before allowing them to dry upon a cloth for 1 week. The severed head was initially placed in the refrigerator, but also being stripped of flesh and painted and coated with enamel. 3 weeks after the murder of Miller, on September 24, Dahmer encountered a 22-year-old named David Thomas at the Grand Avenue Mall. He persuaded him to return to his apartment for a few drinks with additional money on an offer if he would pose for photographs. In this statement to police after his arrest, Dahmer stated that after giving Thomas a drink laden with sedatives, he did not feel attracted to him, but he was afraid to allow him to awake in case he would be angry over having been drugged. Therefore, he strangled him and dismembered the body, intentionally retaining no body parts whatsoever. He photographed the dismemberment process and retained these photographs, which later aided in Thomas's subsequent identification. Following the murder of Thomas, Dahmer did not kill anyone for almost 5 months. Although on a minimum of 5 occasions between October 1990 and February 1991, he unsuccessfully attempted to lure men to his apartment. He is also known to have regularly complained of feelings of both anxiety and depression to his probation officer throughout 1990, with frequent references to his sexuality, his solitary lifestyle, and financial difficulties. On several occasions, Dahmer is also known to have referred to harboring suicidal thoughts. 1991 killings. In February 1991, Dahmer observed a 17-year-old named Curtis Straughter standing at a bus stop near Marquette University. According to Dahmer, he lured Straughter to his apartment with an offer of money for posing for nude photos with the added incentive of sexual intercourse. Dahmer drugged Straughter, cuffed his hands behind his back, and strangled him to death with a leather strap. He then dismembered Straughter, retaining the youth's skull, hands, and genitals, and photographing each stage of the dismemberment process. Less than 2 months later, on April 7th, Dahmer encountered a 19-year-old named Earl Lindsay walking to get a key cut. Lindsay was heterosexual. Dahmer lured Lindsay to his apartment where he drugged him, drilled a hole in his skull, and poured hydrochloric acid into it. According to Dahmer, Lindsay awoke after this experiment, which Dahmer had conceived in the hope of inducing a permanent unresistant submissive state, saying, "I have a headache. What time is it?" In response to this, Dahmer again drugged Lindsay, then strangled him. He decapitated Lindsay and retained his skull. He then filleted Lindsay's body, placing the skin in a solution of cold water and salt for several weeks in the hope of permanently retaining it. Reluctantly, he disposed of Lindsay's skin when he noted it had become too frayed and brittle. By 1991, fellow residents of the Oxford apartments had repeatedly complained to the building's manager, Sopa Princewell, of the foul smells emanating from apartment 213, in addition to the sounds of falling objects and the occasional sound of a chainsaw. Princewell did not contact Dahmer in response to these complaints on several occasions, although he initially excused the odors emanating from his apartment as being caused by his freezer breaking, causing the contents to become spoiled. On later occasions, he informed Princewell that the reasons for the resurgence of the odor was that several of his tropical fish had recently died, and he would take care of the matter. On the afternoon of May 26, 1991, Dahmer encountered a 14-year-old named Leo, teenager named Conrad Sinsenfone on Wisconsin Avenue. Unknown to Dahmer, Sinsenfone was the young brother of the boy who he had molested in 1988. He approached the youth with an offer of money to accompany him to his apartment to pose for Polaroid pictures. According to Dahmer, Sinsenfone was initially reluctant to the proposal, but changing his mind and accompanying him to his apartment, where the youth posed for two pictures in his underwear before Dahmer drugged him into unconsciousness and performed oral sex on him. On this occasion, Dahmer drilled a single hole into Sinsenfone's skull through which he injected hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe. Before Smith and Phone fell unconscious, Dahmer led the boy into his bedroom where the body of 31-year-old Tony Hughes, whom Dahmer had killed 3 days earlier, lay naked on the floor. According to Dahmer, he believed that Smith and Phone saw this body, yet did not react to seeing the bloated corpse, likely because of the effects of the sleeping pills he ingested and the hydrochloric acid Dahmer had injected through his skull. Smith and Phone soon became unconscious, whereupon Dahmer drank several beers while lying alongside him before leaving his apartment to drink at a bar, then purchase more alcohol. In the early morning hours of May 27th, Dahmer returned toward his apartment to discover Smith and Phone sitting naked on the corner of 25th Street and State, talking in Lao with 3 distressed young women standing near him. Dahmer approached the women and told them that Smith and Phone, who he referred to by the alias John Hong, was his friend, and attempted to lead him to his apartment by the arm. The 3 women dissuaded Dahmer, explaining they had phoned 911. Upon the arrival of 2 Milwaukee police officers, John Balzarak and Joseph Garbish, Dahmer's demeanor relaxed. He told the officers that Smith and Phone was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that he had drunk too much, following a quarrel, and that he frequently behaved in this manner when intoxicated. Dahmer added this lover had consumed Jack Daniels whiskey that evening. The 3 women were exasperated, and one of which the trio attempted to indicate to one of the officers, both of whom had observed no injuries but a scrape to Smith and Phone's knee, and believed him to be intoxicated. That Smith and Phone had blood upon his testicles, was bleeding from his rectum, and that he had seemingly struggled against Dahmer attempts to walk him to his apartment prior to their arrival. The officer harshly informed her to butt out, shut the hell up, and not to interfere. Shortly after the arrival of the Milwaukee police officers, 3 members of the Milwaukee Fire Department arrived at the scene. These individuals also examined Smith and Phone for injuries and provided a yellow blanket for the police officers to cover Smith and Phone. One of the 3 believed Smith and Phone needed treatment, but the police officers directed the fire department personnel to leave. Shortly thereafter, Officer Richard Porpican arrived at the scene. He and Garbish, followed by Balsarak, escorted Dahmer and Smith and Phone to Dahmer's apartment, as Dahmer repeatedly commented on the general crime in the neighborhood and of his appreciation of the police. Inside his apartment, in an effort to verify his claim that he and Smith and Phone were lovers, Dahmer showed the officers the 2 semi-nude Polaroid pictures he had taken of the youth the previous evening. Though Balsarak said he smelt nothing unusual, Garbish later stated he noted a strange scent reminiscent of excrement inside the apartment. This odor emanated from the decomposing body of Hughes. Dahmer stated that to investigate this odor, one of the officers simply peeked his head into the bedroom, but really didn't take a good look. The officers then left, with the departing remark that Dahmer take good care of Smith and Phone. This incident was listed by the officers as a domestic dispute. Upon the departure of the 3 officers from his apartment, Dahmer again injected hydrochloric acid into Smith and Phone's brain. On this second occasion, the injection proved fatal. The following day, May 28th, Dahmer took a day's leave from work to devote himself to the dismemberment of the bodies of Smith and Phone and Hughes. He retained both victims' skulls. On June 30th, Dahmer traveled to Chicago, where he encountered a 20-year-old named Matt Turner at a bus station. Turner accepted Dahmer's offer to travel to Milwaukee for a professional photo shoot. At the apartment, Dahmer drugged, strangled, dismembered Turner, and placed his head and internal organs into separate plastic bags in the freezer. Turner was not reported missing. 5 days later, on July 5th, Dahmer lured 23-year-old Jeremiah Wienerberger from a Chicago bar to his apartment on the promise of spending the weekend with him. He drugged Wienerberger and twice injected boiling water through his skull, sending him into a coma, from which he died 2 days later. On July 15th, Dahmer encountered 24-year-old Oliver Lacey at the corner of 27th and Kilbourne. Lacey agreed to Dahmer's ruse, posing nude for photographs, and accompanied him to his apartment, where the pair engaged in tentative sexual activity before Dahmer drugged Lacey. On this occasion, Dahmer intended to prolong the time he spent with Lacey while alive. After unsuccessfully attempting to render Lacey unconscious with chloroform, he phoned his workplace to request a day's absence. This was granted, although the next day he was suspended. After strangling Lacey, Dahmer had sex with the corpse before dismembering him. He placed Lacey's head and heart in the refrigerator and his skeleton in the freezer. 4 days later, on July 19th, Dahmer received word that he was fired. Upon receipt of this news, Dahmer lured 25-year-old Joseph Bradhoff to his apartment. Bradhoff was strangled, left laying on Dahmer's bed covered with a sheet for 2 days. On July 21st, Dahmer removed these sheets to find the head covered in maggots, whereupon he decapitated the body, cleaned the head, and placed it in the refrigerator. He later acidified Bradhoff's torso along with those of 2 other victims killed within the previous month. Arrest. Capture. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer approached 3 men with an offer of $100 to accompany him to his apartment to pose for nude photographs, drink beer, and simply keep him company. One of the trio, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed to accompany him to his apartment. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, Edwards noted a foul odor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor, which Dahmer claimed to use for cleaning bricks. After some minor conversation, Edwards responded to Dahmer's request to turn his head and view his tropical fish, whereupon Dahmer placed a handcuff upon his wrist. When Edwards asked, "What's happening?" Dahmer unsuccessfully attempted to cuff his wrists together, then told Edwards to accompany him to the bedroom to pose for nude pictures. While inside the bedroom, Edwards noted nude male posters on the wall and that a videotape of The Exorcist 3 was playing. He also noted a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner from which a strong odor emanated. Dahmer then brandished a knife and informed Edwards he intended to take nude pictures of him in an attempt to appease Dahmer. Edwards unbuttoned his shirt, saying he would allow him to do so if he would remove the handcuffs and put the knife away. In response to this promise, Dahmer simply turned his attention towards the TV. Edwards observed Dahmer rocking back and forth and chanting before turning his attention back to him. He placed his head on Edwards' chest, listened to his heartbeat, and with the knife pressed against his intended victim, informed Edwards he intended to eat his heart. In continuous attempts to prevent Dahmer from attacking him, Edwards repeated that he was Dahmer's friend and he was not going to run away. Edwards had decided he was going to either jump from a window or run through the unlocked front door upon the next available opportunity. When Edwards next stated he needed to use the bathroom, he asked if they could sit with the beer in the living room where there was air conditioning. Dahmer consented, and the pair walked to the living room. When Edwards exited the bathroom inside the living room, Edwards waited until he observed Dahmer having a momentary lapse of concentration before requesting to use the bathroom again. When Edwards rose from the couch, he noted Dahmer was not holding the handcuffs, whereupon Edwards punched him in the face, knocking Dahmer off balance, and ran out the front door. At 11:30 p.m. on July 22nd, Edwards flagged down two Milwaukee police officers, Robert Ruth and Rolf Moeller, at the corner of North 25th Street. The officers noted Edwards had a handcuff attached to his wrist, whereupon he explained to the officers that a freak had placed the handcuffs upon him, and asking if the police had removed them. When the officer handcuffs keys failed to fit the branded handcuffs, Edwards agreed to accompany the officers to the apartment where Edwards stated he had spent the previous 5 hours before escaping. When the officers and Edwards arrived at apartment 213, Dahmer invited the trio inside and acknowledged he had indeed placed the handcuffs upon Edwards, although he offered no explanation as to why he had done so. At this point, Edwards divulged to the officers that Dahmer had also brandished a large knife upon him, and that this had happened in the bedroom. Dahmer made no comment to this revelation, indicating to one of the officers, Mueller, that the key to the handcuffs was in the bedside dresser. As Mueller entered the bedroom, Dahmer attempted to pass Mueller to himself to retrieve the key, whereupon the second officer, present Ruth, informed him to back off. In the bedroom, Mueller noted there was indeed a large knife behind the bed. He also saw an open drawer upon which closer inspection contained scores of Polaroid pictures, many of which were human bodies in various stages of dismemberment. Mueller noted that the decor indicated had taken the very apartment where they were standing. Mueller walked into the living room to show them to his partner, uttering the words, "These are for real." When Dahmer saw that Mueller was holding several of his Polaroids, he fought with the officers in an effort to resist arrest. The officers quickly overpowered him, cuffed his hands behind his back, and called a second squad car for backup. At this point, Mueller opened the refrigerator to reveal the freshly severed head of a black male on the bottom shelf. As Dahmer lay pinned on the floor beneath Ruth, he turned his head towards the officers and muttered the words, "For what I did, I should be dead." A more detailed search of the apartment conducted by the Milwaukee Police Criminal Investigation Bureau revealed a total of 4 severed heads in Dahmer's kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in Dahmer's bedroom and inside a closet. In addition, investigators discovered collected blood droppings upon a tray at the bottom of Dahmer's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of arm and muscle, each wrapped inside of plastic bags upon the shelves in Dahmer's freezer. Investigators, an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and the flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in apartment 213, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of several hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp, and in the 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torso dissolving in the acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of Dahmer's victims were found. In reference to the recovery of body parts and artifacts at 924 North 25th Street, the chief medical examiner later stated, "It was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene." Confession. Beginning in the early hours of July 23, 1991, Dahmer was questioned by Detective Patrick Kennedy as to the murders he had committed and the evidence found in his apartment. However, the following 2 weeks, Kennedy and later Detective Dennis Murphy conducted numerous interviews with Dahmer, which combined totaled over 60 hours. Dahmer waived his right to have a lawyer present throughout his interrogations, adding he wished to confess all he had created this horror, and it only made sense that I'd do everything to put an end to it. He readily admitted to having murdered 16 young men in Wisconsin since 1987, with one further victim, Stephen Hicks, killed in Ohio back in 1978. Most of Dahmer's victims had been rendered unconscious prior to their murder, although some had died as a result of having acid or boiling water injected into their brain. As he had no memory of the murder of his second victim, Stephen Toomey, he was unsure whether he was unconscious when beaten to death, although he did concede it was possible that his viewing the exposed chest of Toomey while in a drunken stupor may have led him to unsuccessfully attempt to tear Toomey's heart from his chest. Almost all the murders of Dahmer committed after moving into the Oxford apartments had involved a ritual of posing the victim bodies in suggestive positions, typically with the chest thrust outwards prior to dismemberment. Dahmer readily admitted to engaging in necrophilia with several of his victims' bodies, including performing sexual acts with their viscera as he dismembered their bodies in his bathtub. Having noted that much of the blood pooled inside his victim's chest after death, Dahmer first removed their internal organs, then suspended the torso so the blood drained into his bathtub. Before dicing any organs he did not wish to retain and paring the flesh from the body, the bones he wished to dispose of were pulverized or acidified with Soilex and bleach, solutions used to aid in the preservation of the skeletons and skulls he wished to keep. In addition, Dahmer confessed to having consumed the heart, livers, biceps, and portions of thighs of several victims he has killed within the previous year, often tenderizing the flesh and organs prior to consuming them in meals flavored with various condiments. Describing the increase in rate of killings in the 2 months prior to his arrest, Dahmer stated he'd been completely swept along with this compulsion to kill, adding it was an insistent and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost, someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long. When asked as to why he had preserved a total of 7 skulls and the entire skeletons of 2 victims, Dahmer stated he had been in the process of constructing a private altar of victims' skulls, which he had intended to display on the black table located in his living room, and upon which he had photographed the bodies of many of his victims. This display of skulls was to be adorned at each side with the complete skeletons of Miller and Lacey. The 4 severed heads found in his kitchen were to be removed of all flesh and used in this altar, as with the skull of at least one future victim. Incense sticks were placed at each of the back table, above which Dahmer intended to place a large blue lamp with extending blue global lights. The entire construction was to be placed before a window covered with a black opaque shower curtain, in front of which Dahmer intended to sit in a black leather chair. When asked in November 18, 1991, what interview from the altar was dedicated to, Dahmer replied, "Myself. It was a place where I could feel at home." He further describes the intended altar as a place for meditation, from where he believed he could draw a sense of power, adding if this is his arrest had happened 6 months later, that's what they would have found. Indictment. On July 25, 1991, Dahmer was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August 22nd, he had been charged with the further 11 murders committed in Wisconsin. On September 14th, investigators in Ohio, having recovered hundreds of bone fragments in woodland behind the address in which Dahmer had confessed to killing his first victim, formally identified 2 molars and a vertebra with x-ray records of Hicks. 3 days later, Dahmer was charged by authorities in Ohio with Hicks's murder. Dahmer was not charged with the attempted murder of Edwards, nor with the murder of Toomey. He was not charged with Toomey's murder because the Milwaukee County District Attorney only brought charges where murder could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and Dahmer had no memory of actually committing this particular murder, for which no physical evidence of the crime existed. At a scheduled preliminary hearing on January 13, 1992, Dahmer pled guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. Trial. Dahmer's trial began on January 30th, 1992. He was tried in Milwaukee for the 15 counts of first-degree murder before Judge Lawrence Graham. By pleading guilty on January 13th to the charges brought against him, Dahmer had waived his right to initial trial to establish guilt as defined in Wisconsin law. The issue debated by opposing counsels at Dahmer's trial was to determine whether he suffered from either a mental or personality disorder. Persecution, claiming that he had any disorders, did not deprive Dahmer of the ability to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or deprive him of the ability to resist his impulses. The defense arguing that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease and was driven by obsessions and impulsions he was unable to control. Defense experts argued that Dahmer was insane due to his necrophilia drive, his compulsion to have sexual encounters with corpses. Defense expert Dr. Fred Berlin testified that Dahmer was unable to conform to his conduct at the time he committed the crimes due to his paraphilia, or more specifically necrophilia. Dr. Judith Becker, a professor of psychiatry and psychology, was the second expert witness for the defense. Becker also diagnosed Dahmer as a necrophiliac, although she added Dahmer had informed her he preferred comatose sexual partners to decrease one's 75% of the time. The final defense expert to testify, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Carl Wallstorm, Diagnosed Dahmer with necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, alcohol dependence, and a psychotic disorder. On February 8th, Dr. Fred Fosel testified on behalf of the prosecution. Fosel testified to his belief that Dahmer was without mental disease or defect at the time he committed the murders. He described Dahmer as a calculating and cunning individual, able to differentiate between right and wrong with the ability to control his actions and whose lust overpowered his morals. Although Fosdale did state that his belief that Dahmer was a paraphiliac, his conclusion was that Dahmer was not a sadist. The second and final witness to appear for the prosecution, forensic psychiatrist Patrick Dietz, began his testimony on February 12th. Dietz testified that he did not believe Dahmer had any form of mental disease or defect at the time he committed the crime, stating Dahmer went to great lengths to be alone with his victim and to have no witnesses. He explained that there was an ample evidence that Dahmer prepared in advance for each murder, therefore his crimes were not impulsive. Although Dietz did concede any acquisition of paraphilia was not a matter of personal choice, he also stated his belief that Dahmer's habit of becoming intoxicated prior to committing each of the murders was significant, saying if he had an impulsion to kill or a compulsion to kill, he wouldn't have to drink alcohol to overcome it. He only has to drink alcohol to overcome it because he is inhibited against killing. Dietz also noted that Dahmer strongly identified with the villains of The Exorcist III and Return of the Jedi, particularly the level of power held by these characters. Expounding on the significance of these movies on Dahmer's psyche and many of the murders committed at the Oxford apartments, Dietz explained that Dahmer occasionally viewed scenes from these films before searching for a victim. Dietz diagnosed Dahmer with substance use disorder, paraphilia, a schizotypal personality disorder. Two court-appointed mental health professionals testifying independently of either prosecution or defense were forensic psychiatrist George Pomero and clinical psychologist Samuel Friedman. Pomero stated that the murders were the result of a pent-up aggression within himself. Dahmer, he killed those men because he wanted to kill the source of his homosexual attraction to them. In killing them, he killed what he hated in himself. Pomero concluded that Dahmer had a severe mixed personality disorder with an antisocial, obsessive, compulsive, sadistic, fetishistic, borderline, and necrophiliac features, but otherwise legally sane. Friedman testified that it was a longing for companionship that caused Dahmer to kill. He stated Mr. Dahmer is not psychotic. He spoke kindly of Dahmer, describing him as an admirable, pleasant to be with, courteous, with a sense of humor, conventionally handsome, and charming in manner. He was and still is a bright young man. He diagnosed Dahmer with a personality disorder not otherwise specified, featuring borderline obsessive, compulsive, and sadistic traits. Closing arguments. The trial lasted 2 weeks. On February 14th, both counsels delivered their closing arguments to the jury. Each counsel was allowed to speak for 2 hours. Defense attorney Gerald Boyle argued first, repeatedly harking to the testimony of the mental health professionals, almost all of them who had agreed Dahmer was afflicted with a mental disease. Boyle argued that Dahmer's compulsive killings had been the result of a sickness he discovered, not chose. Boyle portrayed Dahmer as a desperately lonely and profoundly sick individual, so out of control, he had not conformed to his conduct anymore. Following the defense counsel's 75-minute long closing argument, Michael McMahon delivered his closing argument for the prosecution, describing Dahmer as a sane man in full control of his actions who simply strove to avoid detection. McCain described Dahmer as a calculating individual who killed to control his victims and retain their bodies, merely to afford himself a prolonged period of sexual pleasure. McCann argued that by pleading guilty but insane to the charges, Dahmer was seeking to escape responsibilities for his crimes. Conviction. On February 15th, the court reconvened to hear the verdict. Dahmer had ruled to be insane and not suffering from mental disorder at the time of each of the 15 murders which he was tried, although in each count of the 12 jurors had signified their dissent. Formal sentencing was postponed until February 17th. On this date, Dahmer's attorney announced his client wished to address the court. Dahmer then approached the lectern and read from a statement prepared by himself and his defense as he faced the judge. In the statement, Dahmer emphasized that he had never desired freedom following his arrest and that he frankly wished his own death. He further stressed that none of his murders had been motivated by hatred and that he understood that nothing he either said or did could undo the terrible harm he had caused to the families of his victims in the city of Milwaukee, and that he and his doctors believed his criminal behavior had been motivated by mental disorders. Dahmer added that this medical knowledge had given him some peace, and that although he understood that society would never forgive him, he hoped God would. Dahmer closed his statement with the following: "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I've done. Thank you, Your Honor, and I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I asked for no consideration." He then returned to his seat to await formal sentencing. Dahmer was then sentenced to life imprisonment plus 10 years upon the first 2 counts, while the remaining 13 counts carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment plus 70 years. The death penalty was not an option for Judge Graham to consider at the penalty phase of Wisconsin abolished capital punishment in 1853. Upon hearing of Dahmer's sentencing, his father Lionel and stepmother Sherry requested to be allowed a 10-minute private meeting with their son before he was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portridge to begin his sentence. This request was granted, and the trio exchanged hugs and well wishes before Dahmer was escorted away. 3 months after his conviction in Milwaukee, Dahmer was extradited to Ohio to be tried for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. In a court hearing lasting just 45 minutes, Dahmer again pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment on May 1st, 1992. Imprisonment and death. Upon sentencing, Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution for the first year of his incarceration. Dahmer was placed in a solitary confinement due to concern for his physical safety should he come into contact with fellow inmates. With Dahmer's consent, after 1 year in solitary confinement, he was transferred to a less secure unit where he was assigned to a 2-hour daily work detail cleaning the toilet block. Shortly after completing his lengthy confessions in 1991, Dahmer had requested to Detective Murphy that he be given a copy of the Bible. This request was granted, and Dahmer gradually devoted himself to Christianity and became a born-again Christian on his father's urging. He also read creationist books from the Institution of Creation Research. In May 1994, Dahmer was baptized by Roy Ratliff, a minister in the Church of Christ and a graduate of Oklahoma Christian University, in the prison whirlpool. Following his baptism, Ratliff visited Dahmer on a weekly basis up until November 1994. Dahmer and Ratliff regularly discussed the prospect of death, and Dahmer questioned whether he was sinning against God by continuing to live. Referring to his crimes in 1994 interview with Stone Phillips on Dateline NBC, Dahmer had stated, "If a person doesn't think that there's a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior or keep it within acceptable ranges?" That's how I thought anyway. On July 3, 1994, a fellow inmate, Salvador Durthree, attempted to slash Dahmer's throat with a razor embedded in a toothbrush. As Dahmer sat in the prison chapel after a weekly church service was concluded, Dahmer received superficial wounds and was not seriously hurt in this incident. According to Dahmer's family, he had long been ready to die and accepted any punishment which he might endure in prison. In addition to his father and stepmother maintaining regular contact, Dahmer's mother, Joyce, also maintained regular contact with her son, although prior to his arrest, the two had not seen each other since Christmas 1983. Joyce related that in her weekly phone calls, whenever she expressed her concerns for her son's physical well-being, Dahmer responded with comments to the effect of, "It doesn't matter, Mom. I don't care if something happens to me. Death." On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer left his cell to conduct his assigned work detail. Accompanying him were two fellow inmates, Jesse Hernandez and Christopher Scarver. The trio were left unsupervised in the showers of the prison gym for approximately 20 minutes. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Dahmer was discovered on the floor of the bathroom of the gym, suffering from extreme head wounds. He had been severely bludgeoned about the head and face with a 20-inch metal bar. His head had also been repeatedly struck against the wall in the assault. Although Dahmer was still alive and was rushed to a nearby hospital, he was pronounced dead 1 hour later. Anderson had also been beaten with the same instrument and died 2 days later from his wounds. Scarver, who was serving a life sentence for a murder committed in 1990, informed authorities he had first attacked Dahmer with the metal bar as Dahmer, was cleaning a staff locker room, before attacking Anderson as Anderson cleaned an inmate locker room. According to Scarver, Dahmer did not yell or make any noise as he was attacked. Immediately after attacking both men, Scarver, who was thought to be schizophrenic, returned to his cell and informed the prison guard, "God told me to do it. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead." Scarver was adamant he had not planned the attacks in advance, although he later divulged to investigators he concealed the 20-inch iron bar used to kill both men in his clothing shortly before the killings. Upon learning of his death, Dahmer's mother, Joyce, responded angrily to the media, "Now is everybody happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for you everyone?" The response of the families of Dahmer's victims was mixed, although it appears most were pleased with his death. The district attorney who prosecuted Dahmer cautioned against turning Scarver into a folk hero, noting that Dahmer's death was still murder. On May 15, 1995, Scarver was sentenced to 2 additional terms of life in prison for the murders of Dahmer and Anderson. Dahmer had stated in his will that he wished for no services to be conducted and that he wished to be cremated. In September 1995, Dahmer's body was cremated and his ashes divided between his parents. Aftermath. On August 5, 1991, as the nature and scale of Dahmer's crimes initially came to light, a candlelight vigil to celebrate and heal the Milwaukee community was attended by more than 400 people. Present at the vigil were community leaders, gay rights activists, and family members of several of Dahmer's victims. Organizers say the purpose of the vigil was to enable Milwaukeeans to share their feelings of pain and anger over what happened. Dahmer's murders were committed at a time of heightened racial tensions in Milwaukee. A professor of community studies at the University of Wisconsin, Walter Farrell, would later state race relations in the city had been in a state of despair for nearly a decade at the time of Dahmer's arrest. In August 1991, an interview given to the Christian Science Monitor, Farrell stated that the news of the murders, as well as the conduct of Milwaukee police officers John Dalzerac and Joseph Garbrish, with regards to the victim, Conorak Suthenfoam exasperated and highlighted the racial tensions within the city. Milwaukee's gay scene was generally underground and transit in nature at the time of Dahmer's murders, with many sexually active gay men using aliases. Many in the city's gay community were nervous of the intentions of others after the extent of Dahmer's murders became known. Although the fear and distrust generated by Dahmer's crimes was short-lived, as the 1990s progressed, the usage of aliases became less common among members of Milwaukee's gay community. The Oxford apartments of 924 North 25th Street, where Dahmer had killed 12 of his victims, were demolished in November 1992. The site is now a vacant lot. Alternate plans to convert the site into either a memorial garden or playground or to reconstruct the new housing have failed to materialize. Dahmer's estate was awarded to the families of 11 of his victims who had sued for damages. In 1996, Thomas Jacobson, a lawyer representing 8 of the families, announced a planned auction of Dahmer's estate. Although victims' relatives stated the motivation was not greed, the announcement sparked controversy. A civic group, Milwaukee Civic Pride, was quickly established in an effort to raise the funds to purchase and destroy Dahmer's possessions. The group pledged $407,225, including a $100,000 gift by Milwaukee real estate developer Joseph Zilber for purchase of Dahmer's estate. 5 of the 8 families represented by Jacobson agreed to the terms, and Dahmer's possessions were subsequently destroyed and buried in an undisclosed Illinois landfill. Lionel Dahmer is retired now and lives with his second wife, Sherry. Both have refused to change their surname and have professed their love for Dahmer in spite of his crimes. In 1994, Lionel published a book, A Father's Story, and donated a portion of the proceeds from his book to the victims' families. Most of the families showed support for Lionel and Sherry, although 3 families subsequently sued Lionel. 2 for using their names in the book without obtaining prior consent, and the 3rd family, that of Stephen Hicks, filing a wrongful death suit against Lionel, Sherry, and former wife Joyce, citing parental negligence as the cause for the claim. Joyce Flint died of cancer in November 2000. Prior to her death, she had attempted suicide on at least one occasion. Dahmer's younger brother David changed his surname and lives in anonymity. Victims: Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. Of these victims, 12 were killed in his North 25th Street apartment. 3 further victims were murdered and dismembered at his grandmother's West Allis residence, with his first and second victims being murdered at his parents' home in Ohio and at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, respectively. A total of 14 of Dahmer's victims were from various ethnic minority backgrounds, with 9 victims being black. Dahmer was adamant that the race of his victims was incidental to him, and that it was the body form of a potential victim that attracted his attention. These contentions have been supported via an independent forensic specialist study of Dahmer's victim selection. The anthropological analysis of which revealed his victims shared a morphological similarity in suggesting Dahmer was psychologically attracted to a certain anthropometric body type. Most of Dahmer's victims were killed by strangulation after being drugged with sedatives. Although his first victim was killed by a combination of bludgeoning and strangulation, his second victim was battered to death, with one further victim killed in 1990, Ernest Miller dying of a combination of shock and blood loss due to his corduroy being cut. 4 of Dahmer's victims killed in 1991 had holes bored into their skulls, through which Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid and or boiling water into the frontal lobes in an attempt to induce a permanent, submissive, unresistant state. This proved fatal, although on each occasion this was not Dahmer's intention. Stephen Mark Hicks, 1978, June 18th. Stephen Mark Hicks, 18, last seen hitchhiking to a rock concert in Chippewa Lake Park in Bath, Ohio. By Dahmer's admission, what caught his attention to Hicks' hitchhiking was the fact that the youth was bare-chested. He was bludgeoned with a dumbbell and strangled to death with the instrument before being dismembered. Remains pulverized and scattered in woodland behind Dahmer's childhood home. 1987, November 20th, Stephen Walter Toomey, 25, killed in a rented room at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee. Dahmer claimed to have no memory of murdering Toomey, yet he stated he must have battered him to death in a drunken stupor. His body was dismembered in the basement of Dahmer's grandmother's house, and the remains discarded in the trash. No remains were ever found. 1988, January 16, James Edward Dexter, 14, met Dahmer outside a gay bar in Wisconsin. Dexter was lured to West Allis on the pretext of earning $50 for posing for nude pictures. Dahmer strangled Dexter and kept his body in the basement for a week before dismembering him and discarding the remains in the trash. No remains were ever found. March 24th, Richard Guerrero, 22, drugged and strangled in Dahmer's bedroom at West Allis. Dahmer dismembered Guerrero's corpse in the basement, dissolved the flesh in acid, and disposed of the bones in the trash. He bleached and retained the skull for several months before disposing of it. No remains were ever found. 1989, March 25th, Anthony Lee Sears, 24. Sears was the last victim to be drugged and strangled at Dahmer's grandmother's residence. He was also the first victim from whom Dahmer permanently retained any body parts. His perverted skull and genitals were found in a filing cabinet at 924 North 25th Street following Dahmer's arrest in 1991. 1990, May 20th, Raymond Lamont Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, 32, the first victim to be killed at Dahmer's North 25th Street apartment. Smith was a male sex worker whom Dahmer encountered at a tavern. Dahmer gave him a drink laced with sleeping pills and strangled him on his kitchen floor. His skull was spray painted and retained. June 14th, Edward Warren Smith, 27, a known acquaintance of Dahmer who was last seen in his company at a party. Dahmer acidified Smith's skeleton. His skull was destroyed unintentionally and placed in the oven in an effort to remove moisture. No remains were ever found. September 2nd, Ernest Marquez Miller, 22. Miller was a dance student whom Dahmer encountered outside a bookstore. According to Dahmer, he was especially attracted to Miller's physique. He was killed by having his carotid artery severed before being dismembered in the bathtub while Dahmer storing his entire skeleton in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, his heart, bicep, and portions of his legs in the freezer for later consumption. September 24, David Courtney Thomas, 22, encountered Dahmer near the Grand Avenue Mall. He was lured to Dahmer's apartment in the promise of money for posing for nudes. Once a laced drink had rendered Thomas unconscious, Dahmer decided he wasn't my type. Nonetheless, Dahmer strangled Thomas, taking Polaroid photos of the dismemberment process. No remains were ever found. 1991, February 18th, Curtis Dorroy Storter, 17, approached by Dahmer as he waited at a bus stop near Marquette University. Dahmer lured Storter to his apartment where the youth was drugged and handcuffed and strangled before being dismembered in the bathtub. His skull, hands, and genitals were retained. April 7th, Earl Lindsay, 19, the first victim upon which Dahmer practiced, later described to investigators drilling technique, a procedure in which he drilled holes into the victim's skull through which he injected hydrochloric acid into the brain. According to Dahmer, Lindsay woke after his practice, after which he is again rendered unconscious with a drink laced with sedatives, then strangled him to death. Dahmer flayed Lindsay's body and retained the skin for several weeks. His skull was found following Dahmer's arrest. May 24th, Tony Anthony Hughes, 31. Hughes was lured by Dahmer to his apartment upon the promise of posing for nude for photographs. As Hughes was deaf, he and Dahmer communicated using handwritten notes. He was strangled and his body left on Dahmer's bedroom floor for 3 days before being dismembered, with Dahmer photographing the dismemberment process. His skull was retained and identified from dental records. May 27th, Conrad Smithphone, 14, the younger brother of the boy Dahmer had assaulted in 1988. Smithphone was drugged and had hydrochloric acid injected into his brain before Dahmer left the youth unattended as he left the apartment to purchase beer. When he returned home, he discovered Smithphone naked and disoriented in the street with 3 distressed young women attempting to assist him. When police arrived, Dahmer persuaded them he and Smithphone were lovers and that the youth was simply intoxicated. When police left Smithphone with Dahmer in his apartment, Dahmer again injected hydrochloric acid into Smithphone's brain. This proved fatal. His head was retained in the freezer and his body dismembered. June 30th, Matt Cleveland Turner, 20. On June 30th, Dahmer attended the Chicago Pride Parade at a bus stop. He encountered a 20-year-old named Matt Turner, persuaded him to accompany him to Milwaukee to pose for a photo shoot. Turner was drugged, strangled, and dismembered in the bathtub. His head and internal organs were put in the freezer and his torso subsequently placed in his 57-gallon drum. Dahmer purchased on July 12th, July 5th. Jeremiah Benjamin Weinberg, 23, met Dahmer at a gay bar in Chicago and agreed to accompany him to Milwaukee for the weekend. Dahmer drilled through Weinberg's skull and injected boiling water into the cavity. He later recalled Weinberg's death to be exceptional, as he was the only victim who died with his eyes open. Weinberg's decapitated body was kept in the bathtub for a week before being dismembered. His torso was placed in the 57-gallon drum. July 15th, Oliver Joseph Lacey, 24, a bodybuilding enthusiast whom Dahmer enticed to his apartment on the promise of money for posing for photographs. Lacey was drugged and strangled with a leather strap before being decapitated, his head and heart being placed in the refrigerator. His skeleton was retained to adorn one side of the private shrine of skulls and skeletons Dahmer was in the process of creating when arrested 1 week later. July 19th, Joseph Arthur Bradhoff, 25, Dahmer's last victim. Bradhoff was a father of 3 children from Minnesota who was looking for work in Milwaukee at the time of his murder. He was left on Dahmer's bed for 2 days following his murder before on July 21st being decapitated. His head was placed in the refrigerator and his torso in the 57-gallon drum.